What's up guys, it's River, and today we're doing a video specific review of the Canon 90D. We're figuring out exactly what makes this such a good video DSLR. Plus, we're gonna go over settings to set this camera up for the best possible results so you can get the most out of your 90D. Also, I'm sharing a hack today on how to get the best possible colors from this camera in post-production. This is a hack that only industry professionals know. It's not really something I've really seen a lot on YouTube. So let's do a deep dive, figure out exactly what makes this a great camera, and how to get the most out of it so that you can stand out. Let's get into it. And before we get into the review, I just quickly want to say thank you guys so much. As you can probably tell by the circles underneath my eyes, I was recently really sick, but I'm back home, happy and healthy. Thank you guys so much for the wonderful wishes, and also thank you guys so much for the super sweet comments that have been on the recent videos. They genuinely make my day. And of course, I'll be leaving a link to all the products we talk about in the description down below, so make sure to check that out. So chances are, if you're watching this review, you already know this is a really good video camera. But in case you don't, this is an amazing video camera. And that's specifically because this camera is designed from the ground up with video first. As for the video specs, this camera does 24 all the way up to 60 frames per second in gorgeous Canon HD. And it also has a specific 120 frames per second mode for slow motion. Although it should be noted, in this 120 frames per second mode, you don't have autofocus and you don't have audio, but when you're doing slow motion, you're definitely not going to be needing audio or autofocus, so that is not a bad thing at all. And as for 4K, it does 4K in both 24 and 30 frames per second with, wait for it, no crop. That is a first for Canon at the time of this camera's release. Most Canon cameras crop their sensor pretty heavily when they go to 4K, and this camera not doing that is actually a huge deal for Canon. And a quick side note, even though this camera doesn't force you to do a 4K crop, it actually still gives you the option to do a 4K crop. Now normally, I'm not a big fan of doing 4K crops, simply because you're throwing away almost half your sensor, but this camera actually has a 32 megapixel sensor, so even with the crop, you're getting plenty of resolution in your actual sensor. You're still getting about 26 to 28 megapixels. Therefore, if you want to do the crop just to get a little bit more range out of your sensor, it's a pretty good idea. When you crop into your sensor, you actually zoom into your lens. So what that means is your 85 suddenly becomes 100 and your 18 suddenly becomes a 24. And that's a pretty nifty trick to have in case you don't have a second lens or you just don't have the ability to carry another lens with you. It's a nice thing to have in a pinch. Also, side note, if you've had your Canon 90D for a while, there's actually a firmware update that you should definitely download. When this camera first came out, it only did 30 frames per second in both 4K and HD, but since the firmware update, you now have the option of 24 frames per second. And as for the actual video quality, if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that Canon HD is to absolutely die for. The colors are amazing, the video is crisp and sharp and highly detailed. It's because the Canon HD itself is actually super sampled, takes the full resolution of the 4K, pushes it down into a 1080p container. It just gives you a much richer image compared to most other cameras that just do straight 1080. The 4K in this camera isn't the sharpest. If you want sharp 4K, I'd really be looking into like the Sony cameras, but the 4K in this is more than good enough for corporate and interview work. And if you're a cinematic documentary shooter, the 4K in this camera is definitely good enough. Also, the little bit of softness adds to almost a cinematic edge. When it comes to 4K, I actually think the Canon 90D has the most usable 4K of any Canon cameras so far, including the Canon EOS R and the Canon EOS RP. And a side note, I was really surprised by how little rolling shutter there is in the Canon 4K. There is still a little bit of rolling shutter, but not nearly as much as the Sony cameras. And overall, I think the video in this camera is phenomenal. The only thing that I really feel holds this camera back is the fact that it doesn't come with a built-in C-Log or flat profile, but I have a solution for you at the end of the video, and I think I have a pretty good solution for you guys. As for stabilization, this camera has digital IS. It's pretty decent, and for handheld work, it's more than good enough, but again, it's not quite as good as the IBIS with the Sony cameras or the GH5. However, this is such a small camera that I actually feel like this is a camera that would totally be okay throwing on a gimbal. And a quick side note, the way Canon normally handles this stabilization is actually building it right into the lens. Now that's kind of a problem if you want to switch lens brands or you want to use a different lens that's not Canon, without the stabilization, so be mindful of that. Next, let's talk about autofocus. I'm a huge fan of Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which this camera has. It's fast, it's reliable, and it's very, very good, especially when it comes to video autofocus. It has face and eye tracking, which is very, very reliable, and when the subject turns away that you can't see their face, it will actually switch to object tracking, which is, again, very, very reliable. When it comes to documentary and run and gun work, this camera's autofocus is absolutely magnificent because it's so good at tracking faces and objects. Like, I almost don't feel like I need a focus puller. And you might be wondering, is the autofocus in this better than the autofocus in the Sony? Not really. The autofocus in the Sony is definitely faster. It's definitely a more advanced autofocusing system. However, the one thing that I notice about Sony cameras, and I do love Sony cameras, is that when they pull focus, it's very robotic. It just goes zzz, zzz. I find the autofocus pulls in the Canon camera are way more organic and they feel much more natural. So just a personal preference, I rather use the Canon autofocus when it comes to documentary and cinematic work. But if I'm doing really fast-paced work, I'd probably go with the Sony, not only because the autofocus is slightly faster, but also the Sony cameras are a lot smaller than the Canon DSLRs. Also, something I quickly want to mention, the audio in this camera never, and I mean never, leave it on auto. The software in this camera isn't necessarily bad, but the preamps in this camera I wouldn't say are the greatest, and I find if you peak even a little bit on your audio, that audio is gone. The audio sounds really juicy when you get it right, but just, it's a DSLR and I really, really do not recommend letting your audio peak. Just wanted to quickly mention that what I've actually done is I've gotten a Rode mic, and what I actually do is I run my audio into this Zune recorder. Sorry, I have a Rode mic that goes into the Zune recorder. I put the Zune recorder up here on top of my camera and I run this into my actual DSLR. And what I do is I have an audio in my Zune recorder plus audio in the DSLR. So if the audio is bad in any way on this, I have a second one on here. That's definitely something you should do if you're planning on doing professional work. But again, I just wanted to quickly mention the audio in this camera, if it peaks even a little bit, it is toast. And last but not least, design. There's small things that this camera does right that make a world of difference for video shooters. A few of the things that I absolutely have to point out to you guys is the side flippy screen. This thing is a must-have for any video shooter. Second, this might feel like a small thing, but this flip screen does not hit the microphone jack or the headphone jack, so you are free to tilt the screen with all of your audio stuff plugged in. Now, a lot of cameras, you end up hitting the headphone or audio jacks when you're switching your screen around, and that can be a huge deal breaker. Imagine accidentally unplugging your mic, shooting for a couple of takes and realizing you didn't have audio. This small thing is a big, big deal for video shooters. And another thing I really like about this camera is the LCD screen right at the top of this camera. You can look down, see exactly where your shutter, your aperture, your ISO is at, and that way you never accidentally mess up your setting. Imagine just having your shutter a little bit too high or a little bit too low, aperture too high or low, and you lose a shot. This is a key thing, especially in high-paced work environments. And another thing that I absolutely love about this camera is that it actually has clean HDMI out. I've seen a lot of people start using this camera for live streaming and live broadcast stuff, and being able to have a clean HDMI out is a must-have. A lot of cameras have HDMI out, but you'll get all the menus and settings on top of it. Having a clean HDMI out is a big deal. However, one small issue with the HDMI out is once you have your HDMI plugged into the side of the camera, sadly, and this is a big sadly, you can no longer flip your screen properly. Although I would imagine that if you have an external monitor plugged into the side of your camera, you probably don't need to flip your screen around anymore. And as for the ergonomics of this camera, they are fantastic. All the buttons are in just the right place. One of the great things about Canon cameras is that they're so well designed for the user experience. The buttons are in just the right place. All of them are nice and clicky. All these dials on the back that we'd use often kind of have like a sandpaper finish, so they're nice and grippy, and you never like accidentally slip your finger on them, so you're never like accidentally changing or not changing a setting. Another really big positive on this camera is the joystick on the back. I can easily change faces during face tracking mode, change my focus points. I feel like for a good video camera, you have to have a joystick on the back. And also the touchscreen on the back is phenomenal. Despite the buttons on this camera being really well laid out, honestly, ergonomic design is off the charts. The touchscreen on the back is super accurate, like as accurate as your smartphone screen. And all the menus are laid out so well that I can easily tap around and just quickly get to all my menus right from the touchscreen. And sometimes I actually find I'm faster with the touchscreen than the actual buttons. When it comes to workflow and speed, this camera cannot be beat. I honestly think this is better than the Sony's. This is better than my Red camera, which cost me $40,000. When it comes to like ergonomics and speed, simply in terms of design, Canons are the best. And while we're talking about the touchscreen, one of the things that I absolutely love about this camera is the touch autofocus. As I mentioned earlier, the autofocus is absolutely fabulous. Having touch autofocus makes your life that much easier, especially in documentary and run and gun environments. And one thing that would have made this camera perfect if it had an ND filter in it. Now, most DSLRs don't have an ND filter built in, and it'd be asking a lot for one. But considering the fact this is a video first camera, having a built-in ND filter would honestly be a huge, huge win. So I really have nothing bad to say about this camera except for the lack of flat or C-Log profile, but I do have a solution for you guys. So let's take a look at 2 hacks that I have for getting a better image out of your camera. The first one is really easy to do and you just need your camera. The second one is a bit more complicated. So the first thing you want to do is you want to go into Menu, and then right underneath there, under the camera menu, page 3, you'll see Picture Style. Now you want to go into Picture Style, hit the middle button on the scroll wheel. Right there you'll see User Defined come up, though you could really use any of these settings. Any of these profiles and change it up, but I like to use User Defined 1, or you could use 2 and 3 as well, but then you want to hit the middle button. Actually, you want to hit Info, which is the button right next to Menu, and it'll bring you into this menu. So here, you want to do a couple of things. You can see sharpness right here. You actually want to turn your sharpness all the way down. Generally, it's somewhere in the middle, but you want to take it all the way down. Now, when you've taken it all the way down, now you'll see contrast. Now, there's a few things you can do with this. I tend to just take contrast down by 2, but I've seen friends take it down by 3. Contrast is something you can always add in later, but I find 2 is a nice medium, and that way I don't get a super flat image when I'm shooting either. So contrast, I'll go down by 2. Saturation, depends on what I'm shooting, but I actually like to keep it at -3 or sometimes -2. You can kind of play around, but -2 just to be safe. And that's pretty simple. And color tone, just leave it in the middle. And you might be like, well, that was easy to do. I agree, that was easy to do. So the next method is brought to us by Technicolor, which is one of the biggest post-production facilities in the world. They post-produce movies like Avengers, Batman, King Kong. Basically, they are the best in the business. And back in the late 2000s, people started to come to them and be like, hey, I shot this thing on Canon. Can you help me put it into my movie? And Technicolor realized they needed to create a profile so that they had an easier time working with these people. So this post-production method comes direct from Hollywood, and it is my favorite way to shoot on Canon cameras. So the next thing you want to do is there's a link down below, and go download the Canon EOS utility and go download the Canon CineStyle LUT. Once you have those downloaded, unzip them into your downloads folder or wherever you want to put them. And once that's nice and ready, plug your camera through the USB port into your laptop and we'll get started. So at this point, you should have your camera plugged in and turned on, and open up whatever folder you have EOS utility in. Double click that and it should pop right up. You should see your camera, whatever, if you have a 90D or whatever camera right there. You actually want to go into remote shooting. Now, once remote shooting picks up, you'll kind of get this little window here, which kind of looks like a Canon control system. You want to go to register. Now, I've already done this, but you want to hit register user defined style, and this should come up. And from here, you get all your fun stuff. You want to hit CineStyle, and in case, well, obviously you guys aren't going to have it installed. So what you want to do is, before any of that happens, you want to hit this button right here, and you want to go into like downloads. So, or wherever you have your CineStyle set up. So in mine, I had it in downloads, and you'll actually see this folder right here called Technicolor CineStyle, and it's kind of like a text folder. You want to make sure you don't go into the LUTs or any of this, because you do have the option of unzipping those. You want to hit the Technicolor CineStyle V1 PDF2 or PF2. Open it, it'll take a second to kind of like initialize, and it's in there. Now you'll notice copyright, Technicolor, sharpness, not defined, strength, 0, finesse, all this stuff right here, and you want to go okay. And once that's done, it's installed. And you just want to exit out of this utility, Not as hard as some of you may have expected, but still kind of a pain in the butt. And with that being said, once you have CineStyle installed, if you go back into your camera and you hit menu, you go back into picture style, user defined one. Now I have it actually set as user defined one for CineStyle now, but basically CineStyle will pop up if you go back into it, hit the info, and you'll notice strength is down, contrast is down, saturation is down. I actually like to lower saturation a little bit more, but I'll do that in post, and that's pretty much it. You actually can change it a little bit here, but saturation a little bit lower, but that's your CineStyle installed. And you'll notice that you'll get a much flatter profile than in CineStyle than the neutral profile that I showed you guys before. CineStyle is actually my favorite way of shooting. C-Log is a dream to work with, but if I don't have access to C-Log, CineStyle is my go-to. And a quick side note, guys, I really don't recommend the James Miller profile. I have nothing against James Miller. I absolutely respect what he's doing. I just feel like it has too much of a color shift and it kind of destroys your skin tones. And the whole point of shooting with Canon is the skin tone. I feel like if I had to choose between shooting with James Miller or Sony, I would just probably start shooting Sony, because the James Miller stuff just makes skin tones really hard. All right, guys, that wraps up the video-specific review of the Canon 90D. If you have any questions about this camera whatsoever or how to install the profiles, hit me up in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get back to every single one of you. As always, there's a link in the description down below for the best pricing on this camera, so be sure to check that out. Last but not least, we're gonna be pumping out a ton of awesome content this summer. Not only is it gonna be gear review, but also teaching you guys interesting techniques. I'm gonna be really drawing from my background as a fashion cinematographer and making music videos, and really just sharing what I know with you guys. So be sure to like and subscribe to the channel to keep up with all the content we're putting out. That's pretty much it, guys. See you next time.